Daniel stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse apartment, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring out at the city lights that flickered like distant stars. At 47, he had achieved everything he had ever wanted: wealth, success, and a reputation that commanded respect. Yet, the silence of the apartment pressed heavily on him, a stark reminder of the emptiness that had settled into his life since his divorce 2 years ago. His ex-wife had moved on, remarried, and started a new chapter, while Daniel remained tethered to the past, his days a monotonous cycle of work and solitude. The sound of his phone buzzing on the coffee table pulled him from his thoughts. It was Alex, his son. Daniel's face softened as he answered the call. Alex was the one bright spot in his life, the one person who made him feel like he still had a purpose. At 30, Alex was everything Daniel had hoped he would be: driven, ambitious, and kind. He had built a successful career in finance and was now preparing to marry the love of his life, Emily. "Hey, Dad." Alex's voice was cheerful as always. "Emily and I are in the neighborhood. Can we stop by? We want to go over some wedding details with you." "Of course," Daniel replied, forcing a smile into his voice. "I'll open a bottle of wine." 20 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Daniel opened the door to find Alex standing there, his arm draped around Emily's shoulders. Daniel had seen photos of Emily, but they didn't do her justice. She was stunning, tall, with cascading auburn hair and eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 secrets. She wore a simple black dress that hugged her figure perfectly, and her smile was warm but tinged with something Daniel couldn't quite place. "Dad, this is Emily," Alex said, beaming with pride. "It's so nice to finally meet you, Daniel," Emily said, extending her hand. Her voice was soft but confident, and her grip was firm. "The pleasure's mine," Daniel replied, shaking her hand. He noticed the faintest blush on her cheeks as their eyes met, and he quickly looked away, feeling an unexpected flutter in his chest. The three of them settled in the living room, and Daniel poured glasses of red wine. As they discussed the wedding plans, Daniel couldn't help but notice the dynamic between Alex and Emily. Alex was clearly smitten, his eyes lighting up every time he looked at her. Emily, however, seemed more reserved. She laughed at Alex's jokes and nodded along with his ideas, but there was a distance in her gaze, as if her mind were somewhere else. "Emily's been a lifesaver with all the planning," Alex said, squeezing her hand. "I don't know what I'd do without her." Emily smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's been a lot of work, but it'll be worth it," she said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. Daniel studied her carefully. There was something about her, a vulnerability perhaps, that intrigued him. He found himself wanting to know more about her, to understand what lay beneath her polished exterior. As the evening wore on, Alex excused himself to take a work call, leaving Daniel and Emily alone. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air charged with an unspoken tension. "So, Emily," Daniel began, leaning forward slightly, "how are you holding up with all the wedding stress?" She hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. "It's a lot," she admitted. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm ready for all of this." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Cold feet." Emily laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "Maybe. I love Alex, but marriage is such a big step. It's like, once you're in, there's no going back." Daniel nodded, understanding all too well. "Marriage is complicated," he said. "It's not just about love. It's about compromise, sacrifice, and sometimes losing yourself in the process." Emily looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Is that what happened to you?" Daniel hesitated, caught off guard by her directness. "In a way," he said finally. "My marriage fell apart because we stopped seeing each other as individuals. We became roles, husband, wife, parents, and forgot who we were outside of that." Emily sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "That's what I'm afraid of," she confessed. "I don't want to lose myself." Daniel's heart ached for her. He could see the fear in her eyes, the uncertainty that mirrored his own. Without thinking, he reached out and placed a hand over hers. You won't, he said softly. Not if you don't let it happen. Emily's breath hitched, and for a moment, they just stared at each other, the weight of their shared vulnerability hanging in the air. Then, as if realizing what they were doing, they both pulled away, the moment broken. Alex returned a few minutes later, oblivious to the tension in the room. Sorry about that, he said, sitting down beside Emily. Work never stops. Daniel forced a smile, his mind still reeling from the conversation. No problem, he said, though his voice sounded distant even to his own ears. As Alex and Emily prepared to leave, Daniel walked them to the door. Emily lingered for a moment, her eyes meeting his once more. Thank you, Daniel, she said quietly. For the talk. It helped. Daniel nodded, his throat tight. Any time, he said, though he knew it was a lie. After they left, Daniel returned to the window, his thoughts a tangled mess. He knew he should feel guilty for the way he had connected with Emily, for the way his heart had raced when their hands touched. But all he felt was a strange sense of longing, a desire to see her again, to unravel the mystery of who she was. And as he stood there, staring out at the city lights, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The days following Emily and Alex's visit were a blur for Daniel. He tried to focus on work, but his mind kept drifting back to that moment in his living room, the way Emily's eyes had softened when she spoke about her fears, the warmth of her hand beneath his. He told himself it was nothing, just a fleeting connection born of shared vulnerability. But deep down he knew it was more than that. It was a Thursday evening when Emily called him. Daniel was sitting at his desk, reviewing a stack of contracts when his phone buzzed. Her name flashed on the screen, and his heart skipped a beat. Emily, he answered, trying to keep his voice steady. Hi, Daniel, she said, her tone hesitant. I hope I'm not bothering you. Not at all, he replied quickly. Is everything okay? There was a pause on the other end of the line. I just needed to talk to someone, she admitted. Alex is working late again, and I've been going crazy sitting here alone. Daniel's chest tightened. He knew he should tell her to call a friend, to talk to Alex, to do anything but confide in him. But the vulnerability in her voice tugged at something deep within him, and before he could stop himself he said, Do you want to meet for coffee? The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Emily hesitated, and for a moment, Daniel thought she might say no. But then she exhaled softly and said, Yes, that would be nice. They met at a small cafe a few blocks from Daniel's apartment. It was a quiet place, tucked away from the bustling streets, with dim lighting and cozy booths. Emily was already there when Daniel arrived, sitting in a corner booth with a cup of tea cradled in her hands. She looked up as he approached, and her lips curved into a small, grateful smile. Thanks for coming, she said as he slid into the seat across from her. Of course, Daniel replied. I'm glad you called. For a while they made small talk about the wedding, about work, about the weather. But then Emily's smile faded, and she set her cup down, her fingers tracing the rim nervously. I can't stop thinking about what you said, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. About losing yourself in marriage. It's all I've been able to think about. Daniel's heart ached for her. He wanted to reach out to comfort her, but he kept his hands firmly on the table. It's a valid fear, he said gently. But it doesn't have to be your reality. You just have to make sure you hold on to who you are. Emily shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I don't even know who I am anymore, she confessed. Everything's moving so fast, and I feel like I'm just going through the motions. I love Alex, but sometimes I wonder if I'm marrying him because it's what's expected of me, not because it's what I truly want. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He knew he should tell her to talk to Alex, to figure things out before it was too late. But instead he found himself saying, You deserve to be happy, Emily. Don't settle for anything less. Emily looked at him, her eyes searching his face. Do you think I'm making a mistake? Daniel hesitated, torn between his loyalty to his son and his growing feelings for Emily. "I think you need to listen to your heart," he said finally. "Only you know what's right for you." Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air. Then, as if realizing how late it was, Emily glanced at her watch and sighed. "I should go," she said, though she made no move to leave. Daniel nodded, though he didn't want her to. "Let me walk you to your car," he offered. They left the cafe together, the cool night air wrapping around them like a blanket. Emily's car was parked a few blocks away, and they walked in comfortable silence, their shoulders brushing occasionally. When they reached her car, Emily turned to face him, her eyes soft in the dim streetlight. "Thank you, Daniel," she said quietly. "For listening. For understanding." Daniel's throat tightened. "Any time," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily hesitated, then stepped closer, her hand brushing against his. For a moment they just stood there, the tension between them palpable. Then, as if drawn by an invisible force, they leaned in, their lips meeting in a kiss that was both tender and desperate. It was over almost as soon as it began, both of them pulling away as if burned. Emily's eyes were wide with shock, her hand flying to her mouth. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel's heart was pounding, his mind a whirlwind of guilt and desire. "Don't be," he said, though he knew he should say the opposite. Emily looked at him for a long moment, then turned and got into her car without another word. Daniel watched as she drove away, his chest aching with a mixture of longing and regret. As he walked back to his apartment, he knew that nothing would ever be the same. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The days after the kiss were a whirlwind of guilt and longing for Daniel. He tried to convince himself that it had been a mistake, a moment of weakness that meant nothing. But the memory of Emily's lips against his, the way her body had leaned into his, haunted him. He knew he should stay away, should cut off all contact and let her focus on her impending marriage to Alex. But the pull was too strong, and when Emily texted him a week later, he couldn't bring himself to ignore her. "Can we talk?" Her message read. Daniel stared at his phone, his heart pounding. He knew he should say no, but his fingers moved of their own accord. Of course. When and where? They met at a secluded park on the outskirts of the city, a place where they were unlikely to run into anyone they knew. Emily was already there when Daniel arrived, sitting on a bench beneath a sprawling oak tree. She looked up as he approached, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Thanks for coming," she said softly as he sat down beside her. "I couldn't stay away," Daniel admitted, his voice low. Emily sighed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I don't know what I'm doing," she confessed. "Every time I try to focus on the wedding, on Alex, all I can think about is you." Daniel's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her that they were playing with fire, that they were risking everything for something that could never be. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I think about you too," he said quietly. "All the time." Emily's breath hitched, and for a moment they just sat there, their hands intertwined, the weight of their shared secret pressing down on them. Then, as if unable to resist, they leaned in, their lips meeting in a kiss that was both tender and desperate. It was different this time, slower, more deliberate. Daniel's hand cupped her cheek, his fingers tangling in her hair as he deepened the kiss. Emily's hands gripped his shoulders, pulling him closer as if she never wanted to let go. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. "We can't keep doing this," Emily whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. "I know," Daniel replied, his voice equally unsteady. But they both knew it was a lie. The connection between them was too strong, too intoxicating to resist. Over the next few weeks, they continued to meet in secret, their encounters growing more frequent and more intense. They told themselves it was just physical, that they could stop any time they wanted. But deep down they both knew it was more than that. The guilt was always there, lurking in the shadows, but it was easier to ignore when they were together. When they were apart, however, it was unbearable. Daniel found himself avoiding Alex, unable to look his son in the eye without feeling like the worst kind of traitor. Emily, meanwhile, became increasingly distant, her mind preoccupied with thoughts of Daniel even when she was with Alex. The wedding was only a month away when the cracks began to show. Alex noticed the change in Emily, the way she seemed distracted and withdrawn. He tried to talk to her to figure out what was wrong, but she brushed him off, insisting that she was just stressed about the wedding. "Are you sure that's all it is?" Alex asked one evening as they sat on the couch, his hand resting on her knee. Emily forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure," she said. "I just need some time to myself, that's all." Alex nodded, though he didn't look convinced. "Okay," he said. "But if there's something else going on, you can talk to me, you know. I'm here for you." Emily's heart ached at his words. She knew she didn't deserve his kindness, his unwavering love. But she couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth, to shatter the life they had built together. The guilt finally became too much for Daniel. One evening, after another secret meeting with Emily, he sat alone in his apartment, staring at a photo of Alex and Emily on their wedding day. The image of his son's smiling face, so full of love and trust, was like a knife to his heart. He knew what he had to do. The next day, he called Emily and asked her to meet him at the park. When she arrived, he could see the confusion in her eyes, the fear that something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked as she sat down beside him. Daniel took a deep breath, his hands trembling. "We have to stop," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Whatever this is, it's not fair to Alex. It's not fair to any of us." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. She knew he was right. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. Daniel reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles one last time. "I'm sorry too," he said. They sat there for a long time, their hands intertwined, the weight of their shared guilt pressing down on them. Then, as if by unspoken agreement, they stood and walked away in opposite directions, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same.